In January of 1920, the 18th Amendment actually took place and became effect. The Prohibition era was now officially upon us. The prohibition of alcohol, the production thereof, was now, and consumption thereof, was now illegal under the Constitution. It became pretty obvious within a matter of months that this is going to be a gigantic failure. Partially because just because it's illegal doesn't necessarily decrease demand. And if people really want it, they're going to find a way to get it, and it's going to happen more conspicuously. As with the modern drug war, prohibition was a failure because when alcohol was made illegal, organized crime would become involved. So you would have mafiosos, the mafia, and other forms of organized crime that would become involved in the production, sale, and distribution of illegal alcohol. You would also have moonshiners all over the country who would create their own bathtub alcohol and perhaps sell it in the backwoods. If you've seen the Dukes of Hazzard, that's what that show's all about. The Dukes of Hazzard, they're running moonshine. Okay, they're making alcohol and selling it illegally. That's why they're driving so fast in the General Lee car and doing all those jumps. Oh, the Duke boys got themselves in a heap of trouble this time. That sort of a thing. Okay. Well, today, cocaine, heroin, meth, all types of different drugs are illegal. And you have major drug cartels, largely centered in Mexico, that distribute them. So what used to be yesteryear's prohibition era organized crime now is the war on drugs era organized crime. What doesn't change is that it was exceptionally violent. And prohibition eventually would be repealed at the onset of the Great Depression, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. But it became obvious, though, that prohibition was not going to work. Even though you have religious fundamentalists in largely Protestant South who saw that alcohol contributed to the wrongs of society, but it was also a bit of an anti-Catholic movement too. Protestants denounced how Catholics, and especially Catholic immigrants, like to partake in a little bit of alcohol. Well, cleanliness is godliness, and we will not have libations. And those Catholics, they like to have libations. Us, non-Catholics, we like to drink our booze in secret, while the others of us don't know. Right? Okay. Otherwise, though, it became pretty obvious that prohibition was not going to work, and it was going to lead to a massive uptick in organized crime and violence centered around that sort of crime. Something's going to have to change. Otherwise, though, the rise in nativism also began to change. See, we had talked in recent chapters about mass immigration to the United States, largely from Southern and Eastern Europe, but also from East Asia as well. It was around this time that it was deemed as being too prevalent. You're having too many people come from various different foreign immigration sources, especially from the prior century. And then now you also have prohibition, and you have middle-class progressives who see radicalized mindset, especially from Europe, the fear of anarchists and the fear of growing numbers of Catholics and Jews also came out about this time. So the National Origins Act of 1924 was enacted largely to curb the number of immigrants that come from certain parts of the country. So it worked on a percentage level and basically a quota system. Only a certain amount of people could come based on a population percentage from certain countries. So you're not going to have mass immigration from Poland or Italy or places like that, basically, or China or Japan. So, along with the Chinese Exclusion Act, the National Origins Act was meant to curb immigration, not specifically to one particular group, but with the idea of reducing immigration overall. And you would drastically reduce the amount of immigrants from 800,000 to 150,000. And it was largely encouraged that if there were immigrants come, they would be from Northwest Europe. The British Isles. Yeah, that'd be a great place for people to come to America from. Okay, yeah. How about people who look more like us and talk more like us instead of those weird Eastern European Mongoloid languages and their Catholic ways and Jewish ways? Nah. Okay, so that became part of it. Part of it was also stemming from the idea that you have an older population who wanted to have America maintain its traditionalism. And immigrants were threatening American traditionalism. Boy, that doesn't sound new at all, right? You hear that to this day. America's going to change if we have so many immigrants. No, America's still a pretty wonderful place in so many different ways. Immigrants aren't going to change America wholesale. They're not going to change the idea. They may change its look a little bit, but they're not going to change the face. Okay? Otherwise, though, because you have rising nativist ideology, the old Ku Klux Klan rears their ugly heads in sheets and hoods again. Okay? The Klan was born out of the Reconstruction era, and they fell apart soon thereafter. However, with nativist concerns and immigration controls, you have concerns that would give a rise to the KKK altogether again. The KKK was begun basically to torment black people and to keep them from voting and to keep them in their place, if you will, back in the Reconstruction era. In this era, they still had that in mind in the 1920s, but that actually took a back burner to the effect of immigrants now. The KKK actually focused in the 1920s more on immigration and fear of immigrants and fear of rising numbers of Catholics and Jews. So, yeah, you still have the KKK who torments black people, but now they're also targeting Catholics and Jews, non-fundamentalist Protestant white Southerners. However, it wasn't necessarily in the South that you saw the largest numbers of Klansmen. You saw a growing number of them in the Midwest. Indiana had more per capita than any other state. You also had Klansmen and even Klanswomen in cities, especially where you had large numbers of immigrants or Catholics or Jews. Then you had people who were concerned and wanted to discourage them. The notion that the KKK is a Southern institution is not entirely true. The KKK found its way all over the place. The KKK may have been founded in the South, Stone Mountain, Georgia, in the Reconstruction era, but it's not solely a Southern institution. That's something that needs to be considered. Okay? But you did have the northern growth in KKK who largely centered their concerns around Catholics, Jews, and foreigners in general. And yeah, black people too. Okay? So much so that the rise of the Klan actually gave way to various different publications. Like there was actually a short film that came out in that era called Birth of a Nation, which basically discusses a glorification of white Southerners and a rise of the Klan at that time. Okay? So Birth of a Nation is something that really became distinct and kind of a rallying piece for fundamentalists and nativists. Speaking of religious fundamentalists, among Protestants themselves, you have a concern with the growing numbers of Catholics in the country. Okay? However, among the Protestants themselves, you have more fundamentalists and more modernists. Because in your suburban and urban environments, You have a number of Protestants who obviously were very spiritual, but they also saw relevance with scientific reasoning. So they would find ways to incorporate their modernist views, to incorporate some of the secular scientific advances with their spirituality. How can we combine both of the two? I believe in creationism, but I also believe in standard biology. How can we do that and encourage both of those things? That was a question at the time. Where otherwise you have religious fundamentalists, largely in rural areas, who completely rejected science, and they completely rejected the idea of evolution under Charles Darwin's theory. So you have competing ideology among biblical interpretations. Should the Bible be interpreted literally, as fundamentalists believe, or should it be taken maybe perhaps less literally and more figuratively? That's a rising conversation that a number of Christians from all walks of life, including Catholics, that begin to wonder, okay, is this to be taken literally? There are religious groups out there, fundamentalist Christian groups, who have literal interpretations of the Bible. Okay? The Bible, the New Testament as we know it, including the Old Testament as well, but the New Testament in particular that Christians recognize, has been translated for across many, many different languages in 2,000 years. Okay? I want you to think about that. Some of the literal interpretations could be lost in translation as well. But also, could it be possible that these scriptures were not necessarily meant to be taken literally? They were meant to be understood from the lessons we can glean from them, how we can be better, how we can serve the Lord better, how we can serve each other and be better for each other. So take the story and derive from the literal sense the metaphoric sense or the figurative. Okay? That's what some of these modernists were trying to explain around this time. The fundamentalists took a direct approach. No, there were no dinosaurs. Moses did, in fact, part the Red Sea. Okay. Could there be possibility for truth between many of those different things? Okay. What also became somewhat of a question around this time was the idea that the Democratic Party itself was also split. See, the Democratic Party back then, kind of much like today, you have various different factions that make up the Democratic Party who don't always see eye to eye. It's like today, the modern Democratic Party is really kind of like two different parties. Okay? And that's kind of obvious when you see candidates like Bernie Sanders and then Joe Biden. Joe Biden is a traditional, he's a traditional bureaucratic Democrat. Bernie Sanders is more of a democratic socialist who has different economic ideas, whereas Joe Biden is a traditional Democrat who believes in the power of government to improve people's lives without actually controlling everything under a socialist and nationalist standpoint. So, but back then, you have a little bit more social concern among the Democratic Party. Back in the 1920s, you have urban Democrats. Oftentimes, your immigrants would follow the Democratic Party. Catholics were largely Democrat. You also had old Southern Democrats who believed in various other different things, nativist ideology, but oftentimes they were competing. The Ku Klux Klan largely supported the Democratic Party. Well, Catholics also largely supported the Democratic Party. But the Ku Klux Klan hates Catholics. Okay, something's going to have to give there. And the Democratic Party would basically kind of split in ideology, so much so that they would lose a presidential election because they were not on the same page. And those are some of the political lessons learned for political parties, is that You may disagree with other factions of the party. Modern uh, moderate Republicans might be more moderate than your traditional Republicans, but if they don't vote together, then the Democrats are going to get their way. We're all going to lose. So let's kind of get on the same page. Or, gosh, Bernie Kratz, if you don't hop on with those traditional Democrats, these Trumpists are going to take over, and we're going to lose another presidential election, and we're going to see a decrease in our ideology. Okay. The two-party system really is a failure. However, in order for both parties to maintain any sort of semblance of control, you can't split. Okay? I would venture to think that a heck of a lot of Republicans are not on board with Trump, and a heck of a lot of Democrats don't believe in the old school traditional ways or are perhaps threatened by your Bernie Sanders type influence. Okay? That's kind of where we are at this point. So you have a conflict of cultures that emerges around this time, largely centered around political dissension, fear of immigrants, anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish sentiment, and anti-immigrant sentiment.